The first police cruiser pulled into the driveway right as my father was blowing out the candles on his 60th birthday cake. And for one long, silent second, nobody in that backyard understood what was happening. Then the second cruiser came, and then an unmarked sedan with two people in windbreakers that said IRS Criminal Investigation across the back in bold yellow letters, and my mother's iced tea glass slipped right out of her hand and shattered on the patio stones. My father stood there with frosting still on his thumb, looking at me across the crowd of 50 relatives and neighbors, and I watched the exact moment he understood that this was not a coincidence, that this was not some mistake, that his own daughter had done this. "Delphine," he said, my name barely a whisper, "what did you do?" I did not answer him right away. I just watched as one of the agents walked past the folding tables of gumbo and red beans, past the banner that said Happy 60th Emmanuel, straight toward my brother Desmond, and said the words that would replay in my head for the rest of my life. "Step out of the house, sir. We have a warrant." My brother's face went the color of old paper. My mother started screaming that this was a mistake, that we were a good family, that someone needed to call somebody. And I stood there in my green sundress, holding a glass of sweet tea I had not touched, feeling something I had not expected to feel after 11 months of planning this moment. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired. I felt like I had finally set down something impossibly heavy that I had been carrying since I was 22 years old. To understand how we got to that backyard in Baton Rouge, with red and blue lights bouncing off my father's prized azaleas, you have to go back 3 years. To the day I sat in a loan officer's office at a credit union on Perkins Road and watched a woman named Cassandra frown at her computer screen for a full minute before she finally looked up at me with an expression somewhere between pity and confusion. I was 34 years old. I was a licensed CPA with my own small forensic accounting practice. I had never missed a credit card payment in my life. I had $11,000 saved for a down payment on a modest 3-bedroom house that my fiancé Julian and I had already picked out, a little brick place with a magnolia tree in the front yard, 20 minutes from where I grew up. And Cassandra was telling me that my credit application had been denied because my debt-to-income ratio was, in her words, not something we can work with. "That's not possible," I told her. "My score should be in the mid-700s. I check it every month." She turned her monitor toward me, and I saw it for the first time, the number that would unravel my entire family. My credit score was 512, not 750, 512. I remember the exact way the fluorescent light reflected off the screen because I stared at that number for so long trying to make it mean something else. Cassandra pulled up an itemized list, and my stomach dropped further with every line. A department store card opened 4 years ago, $12,000 in unpaid balance. A different card from a national bank, $19,000, 90 days delinquent. An auto loan for a vehicle I had never seen, let alone driven, $18,000 outstanding. And the one that made my hands go cold, a business loan for something called Bayou Nights Hospitality LLC, $26,000, 6 months behind on payments, with my social security number listed as the primary borrower. I did not cry in that office. I want to be clear about that, because I know how these stories usually go, and I know the version of me that people expect is the version who breaks down sobbing at a desk while a stranger hands her tissues. That is not what happened. What happened is that the forensic accountant in me, the part of my brain that had spent 12 years finding discrepancies in other people's books for a living, went very quiet and very focused. I thanked Cassandra, I took the printout, and I drove home in complete silence with the radio off, running through a mental list of every person who had ever had access to my social security number. There were not many names on that list. My own. My fiancé Julian's, but Julian had been with me for 6 years and had never once handled our finances separately from mine. We did everything jointly and transparently, so I crossed him off within seconds. And then there was my family. My mother, Patris Acaffer, who had kept a manila folder of important documents for each of her children since we were born, including our birth certificates, our social security cards, our old school records. My father, Emmanuel Ackhaffer, who worked 12-hour shifts as a plant supervisor and had never in his life shown much interest in the details of finances, he was a man who trusted his wife with the checkbook, the way his father had trusted his mother. And my younger brother, Desmond, 31 years old, who had opened a Cajun fusion restaurant called Bayou Nights 2 years earlier with a business partner. A restaurant that my mother talked about constantly at every family dinner, as though it were the greatest accomplishment any Ackhaffer had ever achieved. I want to tell you honestly what kind of family we were before all of this, because it matters for what happened later. We were not a broken family. We were not the kind of family you see in the worst of these stories, full of screaming and cruelty every single day. We were, on the surface, a proud, close, loving Creole family from Baton Rouge, the kind that gathered every Sunday after church for gumbo and dominoes, the kind where my father called me, his brilliant girl, at every family function because I was the first Ackhaffer to get a college degree, let alone a CPA license. But underneath that surface, there was a pattern that I had spent years not letting myself name, because naming it felt like betrayal. The pattern was this. Desmond was the golden child, and I was the responsible one, and in our family, being the responsible one did not mean being celebrated. It meant being useful. It meant that when Desmond needed $600 for textbooks in college, it was understood that I would send it quietly without being asked twice, because your brother is trying so hard and you're doing so well. It meant that when Desmond's first business idea, a food truck, failed within a year, nobody in the family called it a failure. They called it a learning experience. While I, at 26, had been called cold and difficult by my own mother for questioning why Desmond got a check from our parents' retirement savings, and I never had. I had spent years telling myself that this was normal, that every family has a favorite, that I loved my brother and did not resent him for the shape our parents' love had taken. I am not sure I fully believed that even then. But I never imagined, not once, that this pattern would end with my own identity, my own name, my own 34 years of perfect credit, quietly gutted to prop up a restaurant I had eaten at exactly twice. I did not confront my family the day I found out. I am, by nature and by training, a person who gathers evidence before she speaks. So for the first 2 weeks, I said nothing. I ordered my full credit reports from all 3 bureaus. I requested the original loan applications and account opening documents from every creditor, which, as a business owner myself, I knew I had a legal right to do under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And when those documents started arriving in my inbox, piece by piece, I began to understand not just what had happened, but how deep it went. The department store card application had been submitted online, and it listed my correct social security number, my correct date of birth, but an address I had not lived at in 6 years, my parents' house. The signature on the auto loan paperwork was not mine. It was a shaky, unconvincing forgery, the kind of thing that would never fool a trained eye but might slide past an underwriter processing 40 applications a day. And the business loan for Bayou Nights, the $26,000 one, included something that made my blood run cold when I finally understood what I was looking at. It included a fabricated 1099 tax form, listing me as an independent contractor for a consulting business that did not exist, with a reported annual income of $90,000, submitted to a small business lender to help the loan application clear underwriting. That was not just identity theft. That was fraud submitted to a financial institution using falsified tax documents bearing my social security number. And the moment I understood that detail, I knew this was no longer just a family matter I could resolve over dinner. This had crossed into federal territory, whether anyone in my family understood that or not. I still did not go to the police. I want to be honest about my own state of mind during those weeks, because I did not start this process wanting anyone in handcuffs. What I wanted, more than anything, was for someone in my family to look me in the eye and tell me the truth. So I did the thing that I now believe was the most important thing I did in this entire story. I wrote a letter. Not an angry letter, not a legal threat, just a plain, factual letter addressed to my parents and my brother, laying out exactly what I had found, with copies of the documents attached, and I asked for a family meeting. I gave them 2 weeks to respond. I told them that I was not interested in punishing anyone, I was interested in the truth, an honest accounting of what had happened, and a real plan to make it right. The meeting happened on a Sunday evening in my parents' dining room, the same table where we had eaten 1,000 Sunday dinners. My mother had made a pot roast, as though this were any other family gathering, and I remember thinking that the smell of rosemary and onions would never smell the same to me again after that night. I laid the documents out on the table, one by one, calmly, the way I would present findings to a client. I asked my brother directly if he had used my identity to open the business loan. There was a long silence, the kind that answers a question before words do. Then my mother spoke instead of him, which told me everything about how this had really unfolded. "Delphine, you have to understand," she said, "your brother was drowning. His partner had stolen money from the business account, almost $40,000, and Desmond didn't tell anyone because he was ashamed. He came to me. What was I supposed to do, let his whole life fall apart? You have good credit, you weren't going to miss it, we were going to pay it back before you ever noticed." I asked my father if he had known. He said no, at first, quietly, staring at his plate. And I believed him honestly in that moment because my father has never been a good liar, his face gives him away every time. But then my mother said something that revealed the deeper rot in the whole situation, something that became the actual turning point of this entire story for me. "Emmanuel knew we needed money for Desmond," she said, looking at my father, not at me. "He just didn't ask where it came from. He never asks where anything comes from." And my father did not deny it. He sat there, 60 years old, a man who had worked hard, honest hours his entire life, and he admitted that he had noticed unusual charges on a card statement 8 months earlier, had asked my mother about it once, had accepted her answer that it was, for Desmond's business troubles, don't worry about it, and had simply never asked again. He had chosen not to know, because knowing would have meant confronting a truth about his own family that he did not want to face. That was the first piece of the twist I had not expected. I had assumed, walking into that dining room, that this was a scheme cooked up equally by all three of them, a coordinated betrayal. What I found instead was something messier and, in a strange way, sadder. My father was guilty of willful blindness, of choosing comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable truth, which is its own kind of failure, but he had not personally opened a single account in my name. My mother had done the actual paperwork, the actual forging, the actual submitting of documents, driven by a desperation to protect Desmond that I would later learn had roots far deeper and darker than anyone at that table admitted that night. And Desmond, my brother, sat there mostly silent, staring at the tablecloth, until I asked him directly why he had let this happen to me, why he had never once, in 2 years, tried to tell me the truth himself instead of letting our mother handle it. What he said next was quiet, and it was the second piece of the twist. "Because I didn't think you'd understand," he said. "You've never struggled the way I have. Everything just comes easy for you. I thought if I told you, you'd judge me, and honestly, I figured you'd never even notice because you make good money and you don't check your credit that closely." He genuinely believed that. He had built an entire justification for stealing his sister's financial identity on the assumption that I was too successful and too disconnected to ever notice or be harmed by it, when in reality, I checked my credit every single month like clockwork. And the only reason it had taken this long was that the fraudulent accounts had been carefully timed to avoid triggering the free monitoring alerts I used, opened just below the thresholds that would have flagged unusual activity. Which told me my mother had done more research into how credit monitoring worked than I ever would have guessed. And then there was the line that would later appear on my thumbnail, the line I will remember until the day I die. I asked them, calmly, what they intended to do to fix this, given that my mortgage application had just been denied and my credit was ruined. Desmond looked up at me, and something in his face shifted from shame to defensiveness, the way people do when they feel cornered instead of caught. "What are you gonna do, Delphine? Sue us? We're your family." And my mother, instead of correcting him, instead of stepping in with any accountability at all, actually laughed, a short, disbelieving laugh, and said, "Baby, you're not about to take your own mother to court over a business loan. Be reasonable." I left that house without raising my voice once. I remember Julian was waiting for me in the car, and when I got in, he asked how it went, and I told him very calmly, "I know what I need to do now." He asked me if I was going to sue them, and I told him no. I was not going to sue them because a lawsuit, and my professional experience, does something very specific and very limited. It moves money around, eventually, if you win, after years of legal fees and emotional exhaustion, and it almost never produces the thing I actually wanted, which was the truth, spoken out loud, in front of the people who needed to hear it, followed by real accountability. A civil suit against my own mother would have taken 2 to 3 years, cost tens of thousands of dollars I did not have because my credit was in ruins, and would likely have ended in a settlement that my family could spin, for the rest of our lives, as Delphine tried to destroy her own mother over money. I did not want that story. I wanted the true story, told publicly and undeniably, with consequences that could not be laughed off across a dinner table. So over the following 4 months, I did what I do professionally. I built a case. I want to walk through this carefully because I think it matters for anyone listening who ever finds themselves in a situation like mine, that the path I took was not vigilante justice. It was the proper legal process, followed thoroughly and patiently. I filed an official identity theft report with the Federal Trade Commission, which generated a formal identity theft affidavit. I filed a police report with the Baton Rouge Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, providing the forged documents, the fraudulent 1099, and a full written timeline. I disputed every single fraudulent account with all 3 credit bureaus, submitting the FTC affidavit as supporting evidence, which under federal law requires those accounts to be blocked from my credit report within 4 business days while under investigation, which alone brought my score up nearly 90 points within a month. And because the fraud specifically involved a falsified federal tax document, a fabricated 1099 misused to misrepresent income under my Social Security number, in order to secure a fraudulently obtained business loan, I filed a formal report with IRS Criminal Investigation, the law enforcement arm of the IRS that handles tax-related identity theft and fraud, because that particular piece of the crime fell squarely within their jurisdiction. Not just the local police's. I did not do this quietly hoping to surprise anyone in a dramatic fashion. I sent my mother, my father, and my brother a certified letter, through a consumer protection attorney I consulted, informing them formally that fraudulent accounts had been reported, that a restitution demand of $81,400 was being made, the full amount of the fraudulent debt, plus the professional and legal costs I had incurred repairing my credit, and that they had 30 days to respond with a proposed restitution plan before I would allow the reports I had already filed to proceed through the normal investigative process. I want to be very clear about something here because I think it is the most important thing in this entire story. I gave them a real chance, a genuine one, not a trick, not a trap. If my mother had called me during those 30 days and said, "Delphine, you're right, I'm terrified. Help me figure out how to make this right," I believe, to this day, that the entire outcome would have been different and gentler for everyone involved, including her. Nobody called. Desmond sent one text message, 3 weeks into the 30 days, that said, "This is really messed up of you to do to your own family over money. We'll figure something out eventually. Stop being dramatic." My mother did not respond at all. My father called me once, and it was, honestly, the only conversation from that entire period that gave me any comfort, because he did not defend anyone. He said, "Delphine, I don't know what to do here. Your mother won't talk to me about it. I know this is bad. I don't know how to fix it." I told him I loved him, and that I was sorry he had been kept in the dark, but that I could not keep waiting for a solution that clearly was not coming from anyone else in the house. The 30 days passed. The investigations, already underway with local police and IRS criminal investigation, continued on their own timeline, gathering bank records, subpoenaing the original loan applications directly from the lenders, matching handwriting samples, tracing the fabricated 1099 back to a tax preparation software account that, it turned out, had been created using my mother's home computer under a login associated with her personal email address. This is important because I want to correct something the thumbnail might make you assume. I did not send the IRS to my father's birthday party out of spite, timed for maximum public humiliation as some kind of performance. What actually happened is far less dramatic and far more procedural than that, though no less devastating in the moment. Law enforcement investigations move on their own schedule, following their own evidentiary process, and it simply took roughly 11 months from my initial reports for the case to reach the point where investigators had enough to execute an arrest warrant, specifically for Desmond, as the individual who had directly opened the fraudulent business loan account and submitted the falsified tax document, with my mother facing separate, related charges for identity theft and fraud connected to the other accounts. The investigators contacted me only once during that final week to inform me, as the victim of record, that an arrest was imminent, and to ask, as a courtesy, whether I had any safety concerns about the timing. I did not choose my father's birthday party as the location. I simply did not warn my family that the warrant existed, because doing so, frankly, could have been considered obstructing an active investigation. And because some part of me, if I am being completely honest, no longer felt obligated to protect my family from consequences they had spent nearly a year insisting did not apply to them. So that is how it happened that on a warm Saturday evening in late September, with 50 relatives and neighbors gathered in my parents' backyard for my father's 60th birthday, 2 patrol cars and an unmarked IRS criminal investigation vehicle pulled up the driveway, and an agent named Loretta Sims walked past the dessert table and asked my brother to step outside. My father thought, for one terrifying second, that the warrant was for him because he was the one standing at the head of the table when the officers approached, cake knife still in his hand. I will never forget the sound my mother made when she realized it was Desmond's name on the warrant, not a general accusation against the family, but a specific charge with a specific name: aggravated identity theft, wire fraud in connection with the false loan application. My mother was not arrested that night, but she was formally served with notice that she was also under investigation and would be charged separately within weeks, and I watched her physically sway on her feet as the reality of what that meant finally landed. I did not stand there and gloat. I want to correct that assumption too, because I know some of you listening might expect a moment of triumph, a speech, something satisfying and sharp. What I actually did was walk over to my father, who was standing frozen by the cake table, and I put my hand on his arm because he looked like he might genuinely collapse, and I said, "Dad, I'm so sorry you're finding out this way. I tried to tell you sooner." And my father, this proud, quiet man who had never once in my entire life cried in front of me, put his face in his hands, right there in front of 50 guests, and wept. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my entire life, harder even than the discovery itself, because that is when the real reckoning began, the long, unglamorous work of accountability that this story is actually about. Desmond was released on bail within 2 days, and his attorney, along with the assistant district attorney handling the case, reached out to me, as the victim, to ask what outcome I was seeking, because in fraud and identity theft cases, especially where the victim and the offender have a close relationship, prosecutors often do consider restitution-focused resolutions over pure incarceration, particularly for a first-time offender showing genuine remorse. This was the moment I had to decide what kind of person I actually wanted to be, and what kind of family I actually wanted to try to rebuild, if rebuilding was even possible. I told the prosecutor's office the truth. I did not want my brother to spend a decade in prison. I wanted him to fully understand, in a way he had clearly never allowed himself to understand before, that what he did was not family helping family. It was a crime against a specific person, with a name and a life and a credit score and a wedding he was trying to save money for, and I wanted real, structural consequences that would force actual change, not just an apology extracted under pressure. Working with the prosecutor and my own attorney, we arrived at an agreement. Desmond pled guilty to a reduced charge, avoiding the most serious felony counts, in exchange for 5 years of supervised probation, mandatory completion of a financial fraud accountability program, and, critically, a court-ordered restitution plan requiring him to repay the full $81,400, garnished directly from his wages once he found employment, since Bayou Nights had already folded under the weight of his former partner's embezzlement months earlier. My mother, facing separate but related charges, accepted a deferred prosecution agreement, which meant that if she completed 18 months of probation, financial counseling, and, at the insistence of both her own attorney and, honestly, at my quiet request through the prosecutor mandatory addiction counseling, the CHA, charges against her would eventually be dismissed. That last detail is the piece of this story I did not know until the investigation was already well underway, the hidden fact that reframed everything for me. During the discovery process, investigators pulled bank statements going back 4 years, and buried in those statements were dozens of withdrawals and transfers to a riverboat casino outside Baton Rouge, small ones at first, $50, $100, and then, over time, much larger ones, thousands of dollars at a stretch. My mother had a gambling problem, a serious one. It had started, according to what she eventually admitted in family counseling months later, in the year after her own mother, my grandmother, passed away, 4 years before any of this began. She had gone to the casino alone one night, unable to sleep, unable to sit with her grief, and something about the noise and the lights and the temporary numbness of it had given her a place to put feelings she did not know how to hold otherwise. She had hidden it from my father completely, because my father worked nights for years and slept most days, and she had hidden it from Desmond and me because, as she put it later, through tears, in a family therapy session I will describe in a moment, I was so ashamed. I was supposed to be the strong one holding this family together, and I felt like I was falling apart, and I didn't know how to say that out loud. When Desmond came to her, desperate and humiliated about his restaurant partner's embezzlement, my mother recognized something in his shame that mirrored her own, and instead of guiding him toward the truth, toward transparency, toward help, she reached for the only tool she had ever used to manage desperation herself, which was secrecy and financial sleight of hand. She used my identity not out of malice toward me specifically, but because, in her own broken logic, she genuinely believed she was protecting her son the way she wished someone had once protected her. And she assumed, because I was successful and financially stable, that I would either never notice or would eventually forgive it as a temporary, fixable favor. That was the wrong assumption at the heart of this entire story. My family believed that my strength, the very quality they had always relied on and, frankly, exploited, meant that I could absorb harm indefinitely without consequence to myself. That being the responsible one meant being infinitely available to be used. They were wrong, and the 11 months it took for that warrant to arrive at my father's birthday party is the length of time it took the truth to finally outrun that assumption. I share all of this not to excuse what my mother and my brother did, because I want to be honest. Nothing about grief or shame or addiction erases the fact that they committed a real crime against a real person who trusted them. And accountability does not become optional just because there is a sympathetic backstory. But understanding the why did change how I approached what came next. And I believe, with everything in me, that this understanding is what made genuine healing possible instead of just punishment followed by permanent estrangement. The family therapy started 4 months after the arrest, at the insistence of my father, of all people, the man who had spent 30 years choosing not to ask hard questions. Something in him broke open that night in the backyard and never fully closed back up in the best possible way. He was the one who found a therapist who specialized in family financial trauma. He was the one who called me every single week, sometimes just to say, "I'm not asking you for anything, I just want you to know I'm still here, and I'm still ashamed, and I'm still trying." He attended every single family session for the following year, and in the third session, the one I remember most clearly, he said something to me that I think about all the time. "I spent your whole life calling you my brilliant girl at parties, showing you off, and then going home and letting your mother make every real decision about this family without ever checking if those decisions were right. I told myself that not asking questions was keeping the peace. It wasn't keeping the peace. It was keeping myself comfortable, and I let it cost you everything. I am so sorry, Delphine. Not sorry like a word I'm saying to get through this session. Sorry like I understand now exactly what I allowed to happen to you, and I will spend the rest of my life proving I understand it." My mother's accountability came slower, and I want to be honest about that too, because real healing is rarely a straight line. For the first several months, she oscillated between genuine remorse and old defensive habits, at one point in an early session still trying to frame what she did as a mistake made out of love. Until the therapist, gently but firmly, asked her to sit with the difference between a mistake and a choice repeated over 2 years across multiple fraudulent accounts. That session was hard. My mother left in tears, and I honestly did not know if she would come back the following week. But she did come back every week after that, and somewhere around month 6, something shifted in her. She started attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings twice a week, on her own, without my father driving her, without anyone checking on her. She got a sponsor. And in a session in month 8, she finally said the words I had been waiting 2 years to hear, without qualification, without a single but. "I stole from you, Delphine. Not borrowed, stole. I forged your name, I lied to your face, I laughed when you asked me to make it right, and I did all of it while telling myself I was a good mother. I was not being a good mother to you in that moment. I was choosing Desmond's comfort over your safety, the same way people chose my comfort over my pain for years, and I am the one who has to break that, not you, not your father me. I am so sorry." Desmond's road was, in many ways, the longest, because he had the furthest to travel, both in his finances and in his character. He completed the court-mandated fraud accountability program, and he voluntarily continued into individual therapy afterward, something nobody required of him, but that his probation officer later told me was one of the more genuine efforts she had seen in a first-time offender. He got a job managing a restaurant that was not his own, starting at the bottom, as a line cook again at 31 years old, humbling work for a man who had once had his name on the door of his own place, and he worked his way, over the course of a year, into an assistant manager position. The wage garnishment for restitution began automatically, small at first, but steady month after month, a number climbing slowly back toward $81,400. But the moment that mattered most to me was not a payment, it was a conversation, at the 1-year mark, at a small family dinner my father organized, not the big performative kind, just the 5 of us, plus Julian, at my parents' dining table again, the same table where I had first laid out those documents. Desmond looked at me across that table, and he did not make excuses. He said, "I built a whole story in my head where I was the victim of my business partner, and you were just some untouchable, lucky person who wouldn't even notice or care if I borrowed a little of your good fortune. I never once thought about what it actually felt like to be you, sitting in that credit union getting told your life plans were on hold because of choices you never made. I am not going to sit here and tell you I understand fully what that felt like, because I don't think I can, not really. But I understand now that I chose my own comfort over your entire future, and calling it family helping family was just a story I told myself so I didn't have to feel like what I actually was, which was someone who stole from his sister and then mocked her for being hurt about it. I am sorry, Delphine. And I know sorry doesn't pay off $81,000. That's why I'm still working the second job on weekends, on top of the garnishment, because I want it paid off faster than the court is even making me. I did not forgive them that night, not fully, not in some tidy, immediate way that made for a clean ending. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, is not a switch you flip because someone finally says the right words after enough time has passed. What I did that night was believe them, which is different and important, and it was the first time in this entire ordeal that belief felt possible again. The credit repair itself, practically speaking, took about 7 months once the fraudulent accounts were formally closed out following the criminal case, since the FTC affidavit and the police and IRS reports gave me clean documentation to permanently remove every fraudulent account from my credit history rather than just disputing them individually. My score climbed back into the high 700s by the following spring. Julian and I finally closed on that little brick house with the magnolia tree, almost exactly 2 years after that first devastating meeting with Cassandra at the credit union, and I remember standing in the empty living room on closing day, sunlight coming through the bare front windows, and just breathing for what felt like the first time in years. We had a small housewarming that summer, and I want to tell you honestly that inviting my family took me a long time to decide on, and I set very clear boundaries before I did it. I told my mother directly that she would never again have access to any document containing my social security number, my banking information, or my tax records, full stop, permanently, not out of ongoing punishment, but simply because that particular trust, once broken that specific way, does not fall. Lie rebuild, and a healthy relationship going forward meant accepting that boundary rather than treating it as a wound to be healed later. I froze my credit permanently with all 3 bureaus, something I now recommend to every single person I talk to about this. I set up a separate, secured filing system for my own important documents that no family member has a key to, not out of coldness, but out of the plain, practical wisdom that trust and access are not actually the same thing, and love does not require handing someone the keys to your entire identity. They accepted every single one of those boundaries without argument, which honestly told me more about how much they had genuinely changed than any apology could have. My mother, at the housewarming, hugged me on the front porch and said, quietly, just for the 2 of us, "You don't owe me forgiveness on any particular timeline, baby. I'm just grateful you let me stand on your porch at all." My father spent an hour that afternoon out in the backyard with Julian and my father-in-law, laughing about something to do with grilling technique, looking, for the first time in 2 years, like a man who had actually forgiven himself enough to laugh again. Desmond brought a card, and inside it was not money, because he did not have much extra to give, but a handwritten letter and a small keychain shaped like a house, and a note that said, "For the house you earned with your own name, the one nobody gets to borrow again without asking. Proud of you, sis, working on being someone you can be proud of too." It has been a little over 3 years now since that night at my father's birthday party, and I want to tell you where everyone stands today, because I think the ending matters as much as the beginning. Desmond finished paying off the full restitution amount last spring, 8 months ahead of the court's original schedule, and he has been in stable recovery from the underlying compulsive spending and shame spiral that drove his choices. Working now as a general manager at the same restaurant where he started back over as a line cook. And he speaks, occasionally, to a local financial literacy nonprofit about how desperation and pride together can convince a person to justify almost anything. My mother celebrated 4 years of recovery from gambling this past winter, has become, of all things, a peer support volunteer for other families dealing with hidden addiction. And she and I talk on the phone every single week now. Real conversations, not performative ones, conversations where she asks about my work and actually listens to the answer. My father retired last year after 35 years at the plant, and he spends most of his time now in that backyard garden, tending the same azaleas that were splattered with the flashing lights of police cruisers 3 years ago, and every single one of my birthdays since then, he has called me, not to wish me happy birthday in passing, but to say some version of the same thing. I am proud of the woman you became, especially the parts of you strong enough to make us finally become better people too. Julian and I got married in the backyard of that little brick house 18 months ago, under the magnolia tree, and my father walked me down a short grass aisle we mowed ourselves that morning. And my mother sat in the front row without a single credit card statement or a single secret between us. And my brother stood up during the reception and gave a toast that made half the yard cry, about second chances, and about a sister who had every right to walk away and chose, instead, to make her family earn its way back. I think about that night at the credit union sometimes, sitting across from Cassandra, staring at a number that felt like the end of everything I had worked for. I did not know then that it was actually the beginning of the truest version of my family we would ever have, one built not on quiet assumptions and comfortable silence, but on hard, specific, spoken accountability. I did not send the IRS to my father's birthday party to destroy my family. I filed an honest report because the truth deserved to be told, and the law deserved to run its proper course. And in the process, without ever intending it as some kind of lesson, I ended up teaching the people I loved most that real love does not mean absorbing unlimited harm in silence, and that the people who love you back the right way will not resent you for finally demanding the truth. They will thank you for it eventually, once they have done the long, humbling work of becoming people worthy of being trusted again. Mine did. And that magnolia tree in my front yard blooms every single spring now, and every year when it does, I think about how some of the most beautiful things you will ever grow come from soil that had to be broken open first.